So about muscle tissue. So we discussed about epithelial tissues and we discussed about connective tissues. Epithelial tissues, we talked about simple epithelia, compound epithelia, and there's like specific features. And today we're going to start from muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is very important for movement. So everything about muscle tissue is related to movement. Our skeletal system is also interconnected with the muscle tissue. So skeletal tissue, cardiac muscle tissue, smooth muscle tissue. All of these muscles are very essential to carry out functions like digestion, movement, and heart rate, and controlling our major body organs. So other than the nervous system, muscle tissue is also widely distributed throughout the body. So when we talk about the muscle tissue, we have three major types as smooth, skeletal, and cardiac muscle. So if I sum it up, like the summary of the whole thing, what they're going to ask from you in the exam, what will be there in the structure and all that stuff, would be their features and their locations and their functions. And that is the simplest way that you can use to filter all the information that is given in the book. So resource book is like the most important thing. Whatever the thing that you learn from other resources, that's okay. It's okay for your extra knowledge, but you have to know what's mentioned in the resource book as it is. Because in the marking scheme, you won't believe exact same words in the resource book is mentioned, and the points are like distributed and marks are allocated to the keywords present in the resource book, not the things that we generally write. Even though we write a whole essay about something, they won't give you marks if that is not included in the resource book. And if it is like extra information, even though you have a good knowledge, good amount of facts in your head, it doesn't mean that you're going to get marks in the A level paper. So it's very important to write the key factors and question like related points in the resource book. So when I'm describing muscle tissue, I will be explaining all the key points, and I will share a tutorial about the differences and similarities on each tissue type. Okay, so the first thing is muscle tissue is required for movement. That's number one. So movement is a function. So first we're going to talk about its functional thing, and then we're going to talk about its structure. So muscle tissue has two types of proteins. In unit number 2, you learn about these two types of proteins. Do you remember the chart under proteins category, under organic molecules, I mean proteins, there's a chart like catalytic proteins and storage proteins, structural proteins. So in this chart, we talk about actin and myosin proteins. So there's a special name for these two types. Do you remember the name? So actin and myosin are mentioned in that chart, and there's a specific protein name, like as in structural or functional and like that. Do you remember what we mentioned about actin and myosin? No. Okay, so actin and myosin are known as sorry?
Contractile proteins.
So contractile proteins or motor proteins, both of these names are used. So if they ask what are the contractile proteins related to muscle tissue, you have to mention these two. Because in this section, in this animal form and function section, they don't mention that contractile protein word. Even though it is not mentioned in this animal form and function unit, you've already learned it in unit 2 now. So then they can combine those two units and ask questions about it. Ask about features about proteins and general features about these actin and myosin. Like when we start from proteins, they can question about proteins starting from actin and myosin. So they can combine unit 2 and unit 5 when they form a question. So that's how they can combine units. So the combined unit questions are pretty hard because you have to remember the information from two units. Okay? So the feature of these contractile proteins, the name suggests that they can contract and relax. So again, this ability to contract and relax, this functional, I mean like the physiological or the mechanical information about this contraction and relaxation comes in skeletal system, support and movement, which is the last part of animal form and function. So there also you have some information about actin and myosin. Then we talk about something called sliding filament theory. I don't know whether you learned it, but again, that same information is repeating in three sections, three parts of the same resource book, of the same syllabus. So when they formulate questions, professors are very aware about everything. They know everything, like even though we learn it from unit wise, they have a very good understanding about the structure of the syllabus. So they can combine those things. Okay. So when you study, make sure to like refer to those areas also. In that way you can score points, because in structured essays there are many subparts, so anything can be questioned regarding a particular section. Okay, so there are three types of muscles, like muscle tissues present in vertebrate, this word is very important, vertebrate animal body. So there's smooth, skeletal and cardiac. So this is very easy. You learn it in grade 7 also. So these three you have to remember. Then we are going to talk about their structure, their function. So this is pretty easy. Okay, I'll go quickly through this because we have to start the next section, which is pretty long. I don't know whether I will be able to go for my target today. Anyways, we'll go quickly. So in this diagram you have you can see that from the structure they are like very different things, but there are similarities, there are differences, and the most important thing about these types of tissues is trying to remember their features, like their structure and their functions. Okay, so when we talk about the structure, we usually talk about their cell shape and whether they have nucleus, one nuclei or no nuclei or many nuclei. So that is another feature. And the next thing is having striations or sarcomeres. So sarcomere is a contractile unit present in muscles, some types of tissues, muscle tissues. So the next thing, whether they function voluntarily or involuntarily. So what we mean by voluntarily is something that we think and do. Like for example, when you want to write something, you consciously take a pen and write it. So for that, you need voluntary action. But when we talk about digestion or peristalsis, after you swallow some food into your mouth through your buccal cavity or oral cavity, you don't know when it's passing through your esophagus. You don't feel it, right? Even if you take the urinary bladder, formation of urine and passing it out, we don't feel the contractions in our urinary bladder. So those are involuntary muscles, and involuntary muscles means we are not aware about it. We are not consciously doing it. And same goes to cardiac muscle. So sometimes like our heart beating speed and everything, we cannot control it. Okay, so the heart muscle is very special. So cardiac muscle is what I mean by heart muscle. That is very special. It has some unique features. So similar to connective tissues, in connective tissues we talk about blood tissue as something very unique. It has some weird specific features. So when we take a component, if it has unique and very oddly type of features and everything, that part become a very important section when they form questions. So in this section, in the muscle tissue section, cardiac muscle is very important because it again repeats in circulatory system, plus the cardiac muscle tissue has some very unique features. Okay, so the first thing we have to discuss is the smooth muscle cell. I'll talk about that and we'll go to cardiac muscle next. So spindle shape. So spindle means it's like I don't know whether you've seen a spindle, but anyway, the example for a spindle shape would be like a body of a fish. So they have a spindle shape. So this is the general idea of a spindle shape. You can see it here. So this is a smooth muscle. So this is a spindle shape and it has a nucleus in the middle. So that's what we call the spindle shape. And it has only one nuclei. In one cell, one nucleus. And it lacks striations. So striation means having stuff like lines drawn through the cell. If you take this one, you can see bands. So here we don't see such bands. In cardiac muscle also we have some bands, but they are not present in the smooth muscle. So that's why we call it as it doesn't have striations. So striations are not present. It is just a very simple spindle-shaped cell with one nucleus. So what you have to remember, it has a spindle shape, it has one nuclei and no striations, and it is involuntary. So for you to remember this easily, if we take the urinary bladder, we have smooth muscles there. So we don't feel urine formation and all that. Okay, when our bladder is filled with urine or when we are emptying the bladder, we don't feel anything. It is automated. So that's a very easy way for you to remember the action, the mode of action, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. Voluntary means we think and do. Involuntary means it automatically happens. Okay? So, can you give me the 4 features? I'll change the slide. Can you give me the 4 features of smooth muscles?
Spindle shaped.
Yes.
Uninucleated.
Yes.
Have lack of striations.
Yes, striations. One last thing. Voluntary or involuntary?
Involuntary body.
Yes, involuntary. So those are the features that you have to remember. And now they are giving us some locations and like places how it works. So it's churning of stomach. So stomach also has smooth muscles, and churning means we'll talk about churning action later. So it means like contractions that happen in the stomach to digest food properly, and constriction of artery. So when our blood is constricting, like when our blood flow is occurring, we don't feel it, right? So in those places we have smooth muscles. So it would be better if you can remember these examples, but these are not much asked. I don't know why. Maybe because there are many complex and very important other questions to be asked, but these features are so important. Okay, so they are found in the digestive tract. We talked about churning action, and urinary bladder, I mentioned it here, and arteries. So these 3 locations must be remembered: smooth muscles in digestive tract, urinary bladder, and arteries. Okay. And next we have skeletal muscles, which forms our skeletal system. So again, we talk about its shape and whether they have a lot of nuclei or no nuclei or one nuclei, and then we talk about the striations, and then we talk about the function, whether it's voluntary or involuntary. So for skeletal muscles, so let me show a diagram. So this is a skeletal muscle. It's kind of cylindrical shaped, and it has many nuclei. That's the unique feature, and it is something that you can use to differentiate a skeletal muscle and a smooth muscle. So previously we discussed about smooth muscle, it only had one nuclei, uninucleated. But here skeletal muscle tissue is multinucleated. So the next thing is composed of bundles of long cells. So you can see it here. Skeletal muscles are pretty long, longer than smooth muscle cells. Okay, and the contractile unit of these are called sarcomeres. So presence of sarcomeres is the reason for having this striated appearance. So you can see it here. There are some bands-like structures. So these are known as striations, and the reason for having striations would be having sarcomeres. So smooth muscle cells don't have sarcomeres. Because they don't have sarcomeres, they don't have striations. Similarly, skeletal muscle cells have striations, and it's because they have sarcomeres in them. Okay, so sarcomeres is the reason for this striated appearance. That's what you have to remember. Okay, so the next thing is it is usually attached to the skeletal system. It is obvious, right? Skeletal muscle tissues are present in skeletal system. And the next thing is in its voluntary action. For example, walking and writing something, standing up. So those are voluntary actions. We voluntarily do it. It doesn't happen automatically. So that's very obvious. Okay, so we think and we go through a specific signaling of the neurons and we inform our brain about that and all that happens. So that's something that we do voluntarily. Okay, can you give me the features? I'll repeat them so then easily you can remember them. So bundles of long cells, multinucleated, sarcomeres present, because of that it has striations, and it is voluntary in action. Okay, can you give me the features of?
Okay, teacher.
Okay. So, features of skeletal muscles.
Bundles of long cells, multinucleated, uh, presents contractile units called sarcomeres, and because of sarcomeres, the cells are
Striated. Striations are
striated.
present. Okay, good. And action, voluntary or involuntary?
Voluntary.
Voluntary, good. The next thing, we're going to talk about cardiac muscle tissue. So this is very important. So cardiac muscle tissue is uninucleated. So what is the other muscle tissue type with uninucleated cells?
Smooth
Smooth
muscle
muscle.
tissue.
Yes, smooth muscle tissue. So the next thing, cells are interconnected by intercalated discs. So this is something unique to cardiac muscles. We didn't talk about intercalated discs previously. So what we mean by intercalated discs, I don't know whether it's present here. Um, so can you see in these are striations, okay? These are present in this skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle both. But can you see like light colored rings over here? So these are intercalated discs, okay? So they are present only in cardiac muscle tissue. And it involves an involuntary heart contractions. Okay, so I have two questions for you. So what is the purpose of having intercalated discs? Can you find the answer from the resource book and tell me why?
Help relay signals from cell to cell and synchronize heart contraction.
Yes, because heart contractions happen automatically, which means that it occurs through myogenic action. The heart has its own way of like starting its contractions and conducting it. So that's the uniqueness of the heart. And for that, to help this signal from to pass from one cell to the other, we have intercalated discs. So it's like uh, something like passing messages. So there's one person. I don't know whether you've done this. अभी रास्पोर्ट check करना क्या? So something like that. To pass from one person to the other, there's somebody in between. From the left side, some messages come. So one person takes that message and pass it to the other person. Something like that. So for that, we have intercalated discs. Okay. And the most important thing, this cardiac muscle tissue is only found in the wall of the heart. So if we take the wall of the heart, we have like mainly three layers. We talk about main three layers. The outermost layer is the pericardium. So this one, and the middle layer is the myocardium, and inner layer is the endocardium. So in the myocardium, we find this cardiac muscle, which is important in signaling, contracting and relaxing heart. So heart contractions are the only like the most important thing is this cardiac muscle is present in the heart muscle wall. Okay, you have to remember that it's very important. So it's not found anywhere else. And intercalated discs is the next unique feature. So this involuntary action of the cardiac muscle tissue is all like known as myogenic, not necessarily involuntary. There's a special name called myogenic. I will talk about that with the tutorial. So here this is the differentiation. So after the class, I want you to draw a chart like this and write their features, locations, and draw that cell. It's better if you can do it. You have to work with me, okay? I really appreciate if you can do the work that I give to you. That's very simple. It's not very complicated. I'm not giving you a whole bunch of tunes, but I'm asking you to do the work. Hello, can you hear me?
Teacher, now it's okay. Teacher, I didn't hear the part, that
After what
three part.
part?
After that three part, heart,
Which
heart
this one.
consists of three
Yeah,
lines.
heart consists of three sections. As outermost layer is the pericardium, the middle layer is the myocardium, inner layer is known as the endocardium. So that's what I said. I remember that only. I said something else also. So the next thing I mentioned, that the most important things that you have to remember is presence of intercalated discs, and it is found only in the heart wall, which means the myocardium. So it's present in the myocardium. So those are the two things that I said, and I wanted you to draw a chart like this and write the information that I asked you to, like what we discussed. So this would be a short note. You don't have to go through the resource book again and again. You have your own note to remember this section and revise it. Okay? Can you hear me now? I hope you can.
Yes, teacher.
Okay, good.
Okay.
The next thing, muscle tissue. Okay, so this is the chart that I prepared. I will send this to you. So I mentioned about something called myogenic. So this word myogenic is very important. We'll be talking about this again in the circulatory system. So ability of a muscle to contract in ordered rhythmic fashion reflexively without nervous stimulation. So this is something very unique. So heart is not give like the brain is not giving signals to the heart is generating its own impulses and contracting the heart. So that's the idea. So it is very unique. It has something called SA node where the contraction, like the signals begin, and from there it generates its own impulses. Impulses mean signals or electrical signals that initiate the heart and heart contractions. So it is happening with the help of its own self. It's like self, I don't know how to say that. So it occurs, it is done by the heart itself. So that's the idea about myogenic. So usually when something is related to nerve reflexes, if something is stimulated or inhibited by nerve reflexes, we call it as neurogenic. So heart is myogenic. So myogenic action is present only in the heart. So that's what I wanted to mention. So this is the summary. I will give this to you. Okay, we discussed each and everything. So if we like go through this again, so cardiac muscles, the nucleated thing. So these are common features. If they ask about common features to cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, there are enough questions in the past papers starting from year 2000. You can try them out. There are questions like in the five answer questions in the end where you have to choose like A, B, C, A, B, D, and C, D like that. They give choose the common features to both cardiac muscle and smooth muscle, and they mention uninucleated. So obviously that's an answer. That's correct. Okay. So presence and absence of intercalated disc. This is the summary of everything, and it will be better if you can study this and do your own chart. Don't like rely on this. You can draw your own diagrams and do your own chart. Okay. Next, we have to start nervous tissue. So this is very important. Again, I mentioned in the first day that this animal tissue part is the foundation of everything that we are going to study later. So nervous tissue will come back again in the nervous system. Okay. So when we go to nervous system, it has two major structural components. But in the nervous system, if we take the structural unit of the nervous system would be just the neurons. But in general, nervous tissue has two components. Okay, I hope you got the idea of what I mentioned. So, structural unit, if they ask about the structural unit of the nervous system, it would be just the neuron. But in the nervous tissue, there are two components as neurons and glial cells. Okay, so here they've mentioned the functions and all that about the neuron. I will explain this. So I will first talk about the glial cells. So glia means the word, the meaning, literal meaning of the word glia is glue, gum, glue. So that the and it means like it is supporting in attaching things, something like that. That's the idea. I don't remember whether it's Greek or Latin. So the literal meaning is glue. So this, if you check the nervous tissue, mostly glia cells are present. Sometimes more than the neurons, there are glia cells. So they are generally we consider them as supporting cells. So neuron is there, glia cells are there around it to support it. Okay, so that's the idea, that's the function of these glia cells. So when we go to the neuron, generally in the resource book they have mentioned about the motor neuron, so that's present, the diagram present in the resource book. I hope you have the resource book with you. So it is the motor neuron. So when we go and like when we talk about neurons, we consider motor neuron as the typical one. Okay, so in neurons, the function is receiving, processing, and transmitting nerve impulses. So what we mean by nerve impulse is a voltage difference that occur due to something that happened in the outside or inside environment stimulating the body. So if I simplify that, when you hear somebody talk, like calling you out, like when somebody out there is calling you out as Rashmi, and that is the external stimulus, and you hear it and you respond accordingly. Sometimes you might walk towards that person or you turn your head around, something like that. So that's how it takes that particular something is happening in the outside, in absorbs that information and process it. Oh, somebody's calling my name. That's what happens in the, like, that's the that's a very complicated process. I'm going to simplify it. It's like processing it means like understanding what is happening and respond accordingly. Okay, so that's the the simplified version of this process. So if we take the neuron, there are three basic parts as the cell body, dendrites, and axon. So this is the cell body, this large part, and this is the axon. So these are dendrites. So what dendrites means, I think tree-like structure. Can you see the branches of this neuron? So that name was given because of that. So there are specific functions to dendrites, to axons. So each of these parts have specific functions. But in our resource book, we are not really considering all this complicated information. We just talk about the simplified version, which is more than enough. So what you have to know is that neuroglia are supporting cells. That's number one. The next thing, neuron has three parts: cell body, dendrites, and axon. And the next question, can you answer the next question here? What is the basic structural unit of the nervous system?
Neuron.
Yes, it is the neuron. So, do you know the functional unit of the nervous system? Structural unit is the neuron, yes. Functional unit of the nervous system, it's in the nervous system itself in coordination part. So it is the reflex arc, which is composed of three neurons. So sometimes in some systems, both the structural unit and the functional unit is just one thing, but there are systems where the structural unit is one thing and the functional unit is a different thing. So it is like that here. For the nervous system, structural unit is the neuron, functional unit is the reflex arc. Okay, are you following what I'm saying? Did you get what I said?
Yes, teacher.
Okay. Here, the next thing is about dendrites. So we talked about three parts of the neuron: cell body, dendrites, and axon. So now we are talking about individual functions. So dendrites and cell body is used to receive nerve impulses from the neuron. I don't have that diagram. So anyway, so dendrites are taking information in. So information coming from other neurons over here from these areas, each of these dendrites are taking information. It's at the receiving end of the neuron, and through this cell body and all that, information is passed outside from the neuron through the axon. So that's the difference between the function of the dendrites and axon. So if they ask about functional differences between axon and dendrite, dendrites are used to receive and axon is used to transmit impulses from to other neurons, so cells or muscles, it could be anything. So what I mean by that is, so here there could be a muscle, so then that information is transmitted to a muscle. So if there's another neuron, that information is passed to another neuron depending on the situation and in the location, depending on the location, situation, or anything like some stuff like that. This information could be passing to that particular location. Did you get it?
Teacher, can you repeat that?
Okay.
Again?
Here, when we take a neuron, so this is the cell body, the receiving end is the dendrite, and through the cell body the processed information is passed through the axon, and depending on the location or the situation, this axon can lead to different things. It could be to either a muscle cell, so then it is going and end up in the muscle. So for example, there's a nervous tissue near your hand, so when you want to write something, this axon that is responsible for informing your hand to pick up that pen or pencil or something, then that information is reaching your hand. The muscle cell, like the skeletal muscle, is getting this information. But if this axon is near another neuron, so there's another neuron here, and this axon sometimes may be reaching that the next neuron, which is, so in that neuron the receiving end is the dendrite. So this axon can pass that information to the next dendrite of the next neuron. Did I complicate it too much? I hope you
No,
understand.
this one I understood it.
Okay, so depending on the situation, that could be to the next cell or the next tissue or the next muscle. I mean, the idea you have to understand is like this axon can transmit the particular message coming from that particular neuron to different organs or like different structures. It doesn't have to be another neuron. ඒක නියුරෝනයක්ම වෙන්න ඕනේ නෑ. Like the axon has the ability to give that information to the next cell or the muscle or the organ, whatever, according to the situation and its location. It differs. Okay, so when these axons are bundled together, we call it as a nerve. So sometimes you might have heard nerve damages or nerve usually nervous tissue is not very like dividing like as in epithelial cells. So when we talked about epithelial cell, we said that at least after 3 days time a new cell layer is happening and new cell layers are growing like that. But for nervous tissue, they are very rarely dividing, so it's very important to protect that like individually, and these protective mechanisms are there. So we talk about that in detail in the coordinative system. What I wanted to mention is, so axons are like bundling together to form the nerves. So that's the point here. The next thing is, when we talk about damaged nerves and all that, it takes a long time to heal. So when we take people who have damaged their like muscle, they might recover in few weeks or few months. But when we take a person who has damaged his brain, a place where a lot of sensitive nerves are present, it takes a longer time to recover. Okay, so that's something to remember. That's for extra knowledge. That's not here in the book. So the next thing, we have glia cells. So I mentioned that glia means glue. So these are the functions of the glia cells. So actually in the, like when we take the medical level knowledge, this is very simplified, like this is very general idea. But when we take glia cells, there are majorly two types of glia cells, as macroglia and microglia. So macro and microglia. So depending on the location, so microglia are present in the central nervous system. I will write CNS. Central nervous system means the brain and the spinal cord. And macroglia are present all over the body, and there are majorly 5 types of macroglia. This is extra information, so even though in our resource book it is just generalized idea is given, so they've just mentioned glia cells are supportive cells, and these are the functions. So for your knowledge in the A level exam level, you have to study this thing, because this is the very summarized version of a very complicated section in anatomy and physiology. Okay, so sorry. So neuroglia cells, majorly they are macroglia and microglia. Microglia are present in the central nervous system. What we mean by central nervous system is the brain and the spinal cord. And macroglia are present all over the body. So basically there are 5 types, as astrocytes, oligodendrocytes, ependymal cells, radial cells or radial glia, and satellite cells. So those are the 5 types of macroglia. So you don't need them. I mentioned this because, so can you see these like yellow color pigments over here? Yellow color structures. I'll erase this one so then it's better. So this one. So these insulations, can you see them?
Yes, teacher.
So we learn about this in O levels also. So these, there are special type of cells which can secrete these type of myelinations. So oligodendrocytes is a type that can secrete these insulations. So this insulation supports in transmitting a nerve impulse quickly. So if this axon is not myelinated, it will go like this. But when the axon is myelinated, it will jump from this end to this one and to these blue color areas in the middle, and it will pass quicker. It will be very quick, and this nerve impulse can transmit quickly from one end to the other end when they have this insulation. So Schwann cell is also responsible in the peripheral nervous system secrete this myelination, but in the central nervous system, oligodendrocytes are responsible for secreting these myelin sheaths. So these differentiations are there, but according to our A level, we just talk about neuroglia cells and their functions. Okay, so I will repeat these functions again. The first thing you have to know, they're supportive cells. That's very easy to remember, and it's like a helper in your house, somebody who can like takes care of the neuron. The basic idea is that. So neuron is here and these glial cells are around it to take care of it. So it's providing nourishment, providing insulation. So I mentioned insulation here. Insulation means this yellow color pigment, the covering, and replenishing means restoring. So what we mean by restore is when something is imbalanced, it takes it back to the original level. If certain things are not in the proper stage, proper balanced level, these glia cells are supporting the neuron to come back to its original state, normal state. Okay? And sometimes modulate nerve functions, neuron functions, which means they are supporting in conducting certain types of information, certain types of nerve impulses. So this is, you don't have to know the complex like deep version, you just have to remember they're supportive, they're providing nourishment, providing insulation, replenishes,